This is on? It's on. Thank you. Now, I would like to talk to you about a project that I recently worked on with the Asylum Seeker Centre in Sydney. And like many Australians, I've been disgusted the way both our major political parties have treated refugees and people seeking asylum. They have played on the suspicion that some people have for foreigners, particularly those of different ethnic or religious backgrounds. And I believe that this has enabled them to lock up innocent people who are seeking safety and to treat others with no compassion. Now, I think that this has led to a lot of misunderstanding and confusion as to who these people actually are and why they've wanted to come here. And in spite of what our government would like us to think, it is not illegal to seek asylum. Australia has signed the Refugee Convention, and this prohibits sending people back to places where they will be persecuted. Now, I was aware of this, the fact that we never actually see these people or hear any of these stories has led them to just be statistics rather than people. And it's also stopped what I think that most Australians would have, which is compassion. And if they could see even just a few of these people or hear some of their stories. And I was thinking, well, is there anything I can do rather than just shouting at the television like many of us do, I'm sure. And I thought, well, yeah, there is actually something, and it's an odd solution, and that is drawing. Now, I have drawn all my life with thousands of hours of life drawing, and I've had over 50 exhibitions, and I've won the Archibald Prize and various other portrait prizes, so there's a lot of drawing in the background. It's something I'm used to. And it's amazing to me that something as supposedly old-fashioned as drawing can still make a difference in the 21st century. So I thought, what'll I do? I contacted the Asylum Seeker Centre in Sydney, and I wasn't sure if anything like this was possible or how would you do this? And I was answered immediately by the wonderfully capable Lee Meredith, who organised everything for me. And over a 6-week period, I drew 39 portraits of asylum seekers and refugees. Now, these are people who are living in the community, waiting for their applications for residency to be processed. They're people who've recently have been granted residency and are starting to rebuild their lives. And there is also people who have gone through this process at earlier periods and have since made an enormous contribution to our society. Now, these people have fled situations of great danger, persecuted for many reasons, political, cultural, religious, or due to sexual orientation. And they've had to leave everything behind: their culture, their country, their family, often escaping from situations of absolute horror. And it's interesting to know that 90% of people who arrive in Australia by boat are proven to be legitimate refugees who will face persecution, incarceration, or even death if they return to their place of origin. So, what do they look like? Who are these people? What do they look like? Well, they're people from everywhere. They're European, African, Middle Eastern, Asian, everywhere. They look like me, they look like you, they look like everyone. And I thought, okay, if I'm going to do these portraits, how many do I need to do? I knew it had to be a lot, because if there was only a dozen, it would look like a careful selection. And so I ended up doing 39, which is an odd number, but that's because that fitted the first exhibition space for this travelling exhibition. And I drew most of these portraits at the centre, which is in Newtown, here in Sydney. And the centre made sense as a place to do this because this was a place that the people know and trust. And I had a wonky easel and plastic on the floor. And I'm going to share with you some images of some of the people who agreed to pose for me and whose portraits I'm able to show. And even though they're only drawings, as you're going to see, some people still found that they were worried even to have a drawing shown if it was online or something. So these are the ones that we're able to show. Now, originally, when I thought of doing this, I imagined that I was going to work in charcoal. And then when I had this woman arrive in this stunning sari, I realized that would be ridiculous. So they're all drawn in full color, and they're in chalk pastel, which is something that enables me, it is chalk, it enables me to work quite quickly. And they're all drawn in 2 to 3 hours. Now, the 2 to 3 hours is almost embedded in the drawing. It's not like working with photography. You're sitting with someone, you do get a bit of a sense as to who they actually are at that moment. You can actually talk to them. I was amazed at how many people could speak English, so we could have a conversation. And I could try and get a bit of their personality at that particular time. Quiet and gentle, vivacious, stressed, literary, whatever, all different types of people. Now, these drawings are not typical of what I normally do. They're much more straightforward, they're much more of a straight portrait. And also, when I normally work a lot from my imagination. And when I have an exhibition, which is how I live by exhibiting my paintings, they're imaginative works, and they're also works that I can edit out. I make them, and then I select from them and choose what I want to show. But in this case, no. If someone posed for me, I have to put it in. Wouldn't be fair. So even if while they were talking to me, they waved their hands around, as I am, and I couldn't draw their hands properly, they're still in. I was surprised, and I was very happy that the people I drew actually realized the whole idea of this, that it wasn't like treating them as some kind of category, but actually about them as an individual person. So they chose what they wanted to wear, and together we chose poses. Of course, they're sitting poses because they were actually sitting for me for 2 to 3 hours, but they chose that and we worked this out together. They said things to me like, I want to be drawn as I was and what I hope to be again. An African woman, this is not the African woman I'm showing you now, it's an African man. There was an African woman who arrived in a beige jumper and then changed into a frilly extravaganza of this wonderful African dress. And when I asked her why she wanted to be drawn wearing that, she said that her brother made this. He was a tailor back home, and that it was something she wore for celebrations and weddings and birthdays. The portrait of the African woman I just mentioned was also bought by the actor Sam Neill, who was someone that she hadn't heard of, and then when she found out who he was, she was incredibly excited, as was her son. What I hadn't realised, actually, was that what a difference that these portraits actually made to the people themselves. I hadn't really thought of that, but it did. They said things to me like, Wendy is drawing our story, not only a portrait of my face, but of my life. Sometimes it was quite emotional. I often drew 2 portraits a day, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And in the morning, I had someone who was very stressed and shaking with worry about someone who they were worried about back home who was in danger. And then in the afternoon, I drew someone who was so happy she just couldn't stop smiling because she had just got residency. And she was still in this state of euphoria, even though it meant never being able to return home and never to see her family again. Now, not everyone could publicly share their stories, or obviously their images, as I said, because it might jeopardize people back home, but also it might cause a problem with their application for residency or protection. So in some cases, with these portraits, their names were changed and their country of origin not exactly said. And there was a catalogue that accompanied this exhibition which travelled around Australia. There are also texts that accompanied each portrait, which is important. So you get to see their face, but you also get a bit of information about why they came here, if we can have that information, which sometimes we can't, and also about them. Now, these text panels were put together by Tammy Bernstock, who interviewed sensitively each person and then wrote the texts in their words. These were then sent to the people and to see if that was how they wanted to be presented. Some people wrote their own texts. Here are a few quotes from some of the texts to help you understand a little more about some of these people. When I was little, my father gave me money for clothes and I hurried to the bookshop and bought books instead. In my country, the electricity often goes off, so I look at the stars and moon outside. When you listen and make music, sorrow flies away. I like pop music, Dolly Parton. I like working with people, helping people. I'm grateful because I was so lost. People helped me, and I just feel like giving back. So I'm going to tell you just about a couple of these portraits in a bit more depth. This is a portrait of Hikmat Shah, who was a very successful businessman back in Pakistan. And he was employing thousands of people across a variety of businesses, which included a social enterprise which helped rural women with employment and welfare. One of his relatives got involved with the Taliban, and they targeted him and tried to kill him. He was shot while taking his 3-year-old daughter to preschool and seriously wounded. He recovered from that miraculously, and then they tried again, and he realized they had to get out. So he had to leave everything behind. He would have had a very nice house, a very good situation, had to leave it all. The family came here after traveling around for 2 years in 8 different places. It was quite an awful journey, but they managed to get here. And through a loan scheme, Hikmat bought a taxi and is working to start a new business. When he arrived to pose for the portrait, he arrived in his taxi driver's uniform, and then he changed into the suit and tie as the businessman he was before, and is already starting to become again. He's already working on schemes and doing things now. Since then, his wife and children and he have become Australian citizens, and he recently won a COAC Local Heroes Award, which was given to him at Parliament House in Canberra. Here is a picture of Mosmos, who was a nurse in her home country and hopes eventually to be one here. She wanted to be drawn in her nurse's uniform, and I'd like you to note that she has a silly little sparkly medallion, which is a smiley face around her neck. She said, when I'm working in hospital, I always like to wear this because people are so stressed and worried that this makes them feel better and just eases that. These portraits were shown on television on an ABC Compass program, and it followed 3 of the portraits that I drew. The one of Hikmat we just looked at, the businessman, and this portrait, this is May and her daughter Stefania. May is now working in Condobolin out in the country as a doctor in Aboriginal health. And this is Riz, who is a businessman in the western suburbs employing 5 people. He was the other person that you saw on television. Now, all the portraits were for sale, and all the money raised went entirely to the Asylum Seeker Centre. Now, there were some lovely and unexpected links made between all this. There was a QC who bought a portrait of a young man who was studying law. There was an Australian winemaker who bought a portrait of someone who was a winemaker in their home country. And there were some people who became friends with sitters. There's so many stories that, unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you them all, but really quite moving and lovely. Here are the portraits in my studio before they were framed. So this gives you an idea of the diversity of them. In 2018, which a few years after I did all these portraits, The situation has actually got worse. Who would think it could? Globally, there are over 65 million displaced people, half of whom are under 18. We are a wealthy country who takes so few people in comparison to other countries. The current government's cruel decision to slowly take away all income and welfare support will result in further trauma, homelessness, destitution, and exploitation. Think of Gandhi's famous quote, "The true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members." We need Australia with a new ethical vision, one that should be central to the democratic and humane society that we claim to be. I am proud to be an ambassador for the Asylum Seeker Centre. The centre provides personal and practical support, such as legal advice, accommodation, healthcare, food, employment assistance. It currently supports over 3,300 people who are seeking asylum. The centre relies on fundraising and donations. It's grown eightfold, and in the last 5 years, there are now some paid staff and there are over 450 active volunteers. Everyone can do something. Write to politicians. It does make a difference. Let them know that what they're doing is wrong and this should not be our country doing these terrible things. Write to politicians. And donate to the centre. Everything helps. Every bit helps. I hope that in some small way, this project of portraits helps rebalance the situation and reminds us that this is about individual people, real people, people who are fleeing from situations so horrific that most of us can't imagine. Real people, people who could be us. Thank you.